Please help me welcome, with the Big Music Therapy Association round of applause, our esteemed speaker, Dr. Aniruddh Patel.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? All the way in the back? Yes, good? Okay, great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. I've loved the conference so far. It's my first AMTA conference. So let me begin by thanking you for reaching out to me, especially the people at AMTA that invited me and made it really appealing to come here. Andy Farbman, who first called me, Marcia Humpel, Al Bumanis, and Barbara Wheeler. And then a special thanks to some San Diego music therapists who I've been getting to know, who've really reached out and welcomed me to come and observe the world of music therapy in practice, watch them working with patients, for example, Parkinson's patients or autistic patients. And this has been a tremendous learning experience, which I'm just starting, and I hope to continue. So people like Barbara Royer, Julie Guy, Angela Neve, Shauna Pugh, Kat Fulton, and Michelle Lazar. So thank you all. And let me also issue an invitation to you about a conference that concerns basic research on music perception and cognition, which will be held in August. For those of you who need your next West Coast fix by then, this is going to be perfect because it's in Seattle in August, which is the best month to be there. In fact, if you'd like to submit some research to the conference, the abstract deadline is December 15th, so please consider doing that. Okay, so my topic today is about building bridges between music, neuroscience, which is my field, and music therapy. And so let me just start by asking kind of an obvious question. What can we offer each other? Why should we do this? Well, I think that's an easy one. Neuroscience is useful to music therapy because it can offer insights into the causal mechanisms that underlie the effects of music on the body and the brain. And understanding these mechanisms has all kinds of repercussions, I think, for music therapy. So, for example, getting referrals from physicians because they understand that this is a therapy that has an effect on the brain, they understand the mechanism of that effect. Getting reimbursement from insurance companies. And of course, designing better therapies. Conversely, I think music therapy has a lot to offer music neuroscience because it has enormous wealth of observation and study on how music affects people, and it gives us a chance to connect our basic science to the real world in terms of practical benefits. And I think everybody in my field is very interested in that. Now, of course, some bridges already exist between the field in terms of energetic individuals who are really working actively in both fields, like Mike Taut, who you probably know, Gottfried Schlaug, Eckhard Altenmuller in Europe, and there are other names I could have added to this list. So it's not that there aren't bridges. The real question is, why aren't connections being formed more quickly, given that these two fields have some similar interests? So how can we accelerate the rate of connection? Well, to answer this question, I think we really need to address the cultural differences between music neuroscience and music therapy. Now, cultural differences are powerful things. Think how close these two cultures are geographically, separated by a little narrow body of water, and now there's actually a tunnel that connects them. But think how different they are mentally. So in this talk, I will talk a bit about the culture of music neuroscience and how I think we can increase the rate of bridge building between music neuroscience and music therapy. So the talk outline is a bit about the culture of music neuroscience, which I have abbreviated MN in this talk, and raising music neuroscience's interest in music therapy, which you'll see I've abbreviated MT, and then helping these two areas connect, and then giving an example of a synergy between these two fields. I'll spend most of the talk on issues 2 and 3. Okay, what is music neuroscience? Well, that's simple. It's the study of the brain mechanisms underlying the perception and production of music. Now, this field actually has old roots which go back to studies of patients, of people that had brain damage of one kind or another that have had preservation or disruption to their musical skills. So, for example, there's a well-known case in the neurological literature of a composer, Russian composer Shebelin, who was studied by the famous neuropsychologist Luria. Shebelin had a couple of strokes and found it very difficult to communicate with language, but continued to compose music, including music that was recognized as very good music by Shostakovich and others. This raised interesting questions about the separation of music and other cognitive skills like language. So this work has continued, and it's included studies of not just professional musicians, but everyday people. And what's emerged is the basic insight is that music, when it breaks down after brain damage, doesn't just break down as a whole. People don't just become bad at music if they have a musical problem. Sometimes they just have problems with melody, or sometimes just with rhythm, or sometimes just with harmony, or sometimes just with timbre. So it really is showing that music is a complex system with many parts, as you might expect. So the roots in neuropsychology are old. But there's been a surge of new research now based on the new tools of neuroscience. That's functional imaging, being able to look inside healthy brains as they process music, allowing us to get pictures like this. This is an image from my colleague Stefan Kolsch in Germany. This is a functional brain imaging picture of a person's brain as they process musical harmony. I hope you can see this. It might be hard in the back, but it's left and right sides of the brain, and there's some patches, red-colored patches, that are more active when the person is processing the harmonic structure of music. Now, one thing you can see immediately is those patches aren't just in the auditory areas, which are just sort of on the sides of the brain. There's patches in the front, in the back, and this is just processing one little aspect of harmony. If I could overlay slides processing rhythm and then processing timbre and then emotion and memory, the brain would light up like a Christmas tree. It's just so much of the brain is involved in music that it really raises interesting questions about why that happens, what is the relationship of music to other cognitive systems. But one basic insight has been that music engages much of the brain. And so both of these lines of research, the neuropsychology and the neuroimaging, are painting a picture of a very complex cognitive and neural system, as complex as language or any other cognitive function you really care to think of. So what are some of the tools that music neuroscientists use? I've put pictures of some of them up here. EEG, measuring brain waves, or MEG, measuring magnetic brain waves, which is sort of the counterpart. MRI, which you're all familiar with, and PET, another way of scanning activity in the brain. These techniques tend to be better at giving us information about the timing of brain activity, and these about the location of brain activity. But rather than going into a lot of technical details about these tools, they basically all let us look inside the head. I want to talk a little bit about how the tools constrain the questions. Now, just look at these tools. What do they all have in common? You have to kind of have one person sitting still while they're doing these things, right? This is not a social interactive situation. You're kind of delivering music over some kind of earphones while they process it. So it gives you a picture of music and musical cognition that's a bit like the thinker, Rodin's thinker. It's the isolated person having deep thoughts while they process music. That's different from music therapy. It's not social and interactive. The neural study of musical interactions is just beginning, and I think it's a very promising area. But you can see already how our tools shape our questions to some extent. Okay, the music neuroscience community is a young community. In fact, it really only has come together as a community in this decade, and that's quite different from music therapy, which reaches back till after World War II. But we are now a community, and that's an exciting development. There's enough of us that know each other and interact regularly to feel like we're a community. That's been spurred on by conferences. There's been 4 music neuroscience conferences since 2000. The first one was in 2000. That was a landmark conference in terms of bringing us together from all over the world and saying, hey, we actually have a group of people that have some shared interests and should be working collaboratively. Having papers published in good journals that we can read and that are widely read by other scientists. Having collaborations that bring us together across our various labs, and having centers for research and training. So in 2005, our field had a landmark with the foundation of a multi-million-dollar center in Canada called BRAHMS, I think it's International Center for International Laboratory for Brain, Music, and Sound Research, that was funded by the Canadian government, really aimed at basic research on music and the brain. And we hope that there'll be more such institutes. But these sorts of things have really brought us together and brought us to life as a community. But it's a small community. I would say that on the order of 500 people, which again is much smaller than the music therapy community. But it's growing. Well, if you go to these conferences or and meet some of the people in the field, what is their background intellectually? Where do they come from? Most of these people come from training in cognitive neuroscience or experimental psychology, which gives them a certain set of tools and a certain perspective. That means they've been trained in experimental design, data analysis, scientific writing. They typically have no clinical training at all. These are people who study music and the brain, but they themselves may not have been trained in music, for example, or working with patients, though all of us in the field have a deep love of music. People in the field tend to focus on mechanisms rather than on individuals, and that's a very different perspective from music therapy. Well, why do we take this approach? Speaking for myself, it's not because I think science will one day provide an all-encompassing explanation of musical experience. William Sears in 1968 wrote that the scientific approach does not negate the present mysterious beauty of music, and I would agree. For me, science actually deepens my wonder of the musical phenomenon. And I study music in this way, in the way that I'm describing on this slide, because I think it can help us understand some of the mechanisms that we use when we process music. But this kind of background does lead music neuroscientists to have certain characteristics. Tend to be rather critical of each other, in particular, of our work. And we have a common currency, which is numbers, numerical data. What are some questions that drive music neuroscientific research? Now, there are many. I'll just list a few today, just to give you a sense of some of the questions that excite people. Are there brain areas or brain circuits that are exclusively devoted to musical processing? That is music its own special system in the brain, or is it put together from other cognitive systems? That's a big ongoing debate. Does musical training influence brain structure? Are some people just born with musical brains, or does music training actually shape and influence the brain over the course of the life? We already know that musicians' brains look different from non-musicians' brains structurally, but is that inborn, or is that a product of experience? Does the motor system play a role in musical rhythm perception, even in the absence of movement? So this is an interesting question. People would think, oh, rhythm, that's auditory, so that must be just the auditory system. But actually, there's growing evidence that when people hear rhythms, even if they don't physically move at all, they're somehow engaging their motor system to help the auditory system keep track of time and beats and so forth. But the point I want to make about all these things, that these are all usually stemming from some sort of theoretical debate. And so the questions usually are motivated by theoretical debates rather than by practical concerns. Now, the history of science has taught us that this is not necessarily a bad thing, that often breakthroughs that affect many people's lives in terms of real-world implications started in very basic science questions that didn't seem to have obvious application to the real world. But how can we try and raise more interest in music neuroscience towards music therapy and issues that are more directly relevant to the concerns of music therapy? Well, I take the goal of music therapy as I see it is to use music to serve non-musical treatment goals. If somebody is a bad musician, you don't think to yourself, oh gosh, this guy really needs to see a music therapist. It's not about making people better musicians. It's about using music to do something else and help them with something else in their life. I think the closest related question for music neuroscience is, to what extent does musical behavior influence non-musical brain functions? Now, this is a question in music neuroscience, but it's not really a central question. Now, I think one strategy then for attracting more music neuroscience interest to the issues relevant for music therapy is to hitch this question to a big theoretical debate in music neuroscience. And I think that's actually possible. In fact, I think it's maybe possible to connect this question to one of the biggest debates in the field. And that debate has to do with maybe one of the most fundamental questions about music, which is, where did music come from? Why do we have it? What are the origins of music? We know music is very old. We know it's universal. It's in every human culture. And we now know it's very old. This is a picture of a bone flute from a paper that was published in Nature earlier this year. This was made from the wing bone of a swan, I believe, unearthed in a cave in Germany. And it's a really ancient musical instrument. To give you some sense of how ancient, remember that agriculture, the development of agriculture in our species is about 10,000 years old, and the development of writing is about 4,500 to 5,000 years old. This flute, when they dated it, was 36,000 years old. So this is soon after humans had arrived in southern Europe. So music has a very ancient history in our species, and that's intrigued people, and people have been thinking about why we have music for a long time. Darwin thought about it and wrote about it in his book, The Descent of Man, and he came up with kind of an adaptationist story that we have music because it helped our ancestors survive. And he thought human music originated in kind of courtship songs, even before we had language, that humans sang to each other as a way of courting each other, the way that birds do, in a sense, birds use song to attract mates. But already in the 1800s, during that early period, there were skeptics. like William James, who wrote in his Principles of Psychology that no, music is not an adaptation. It's just an accidental byproduct of our nervous system. We have this intelligent brain, and music somehow just came along for the ride, but it's not serving any function for us in our species. So this debate kind of went quiet after a lot of discussion in the late 1800s. But then around 2000, it really started to heat up again. And now it's actually a big topic in the cognitive science of music. And two main positions have emerged. There's a position that it's a biological adaptation, quite apart from Darwin's own suggestion about music as courtship. There have been many other suggestions that music helped with bonding groups together, and those groups survive better than other groups and so forth. There's been a number of theories about how music could have helped our ancestors survive. But there've also, and so those theories take the biological adaptation perspective, which claim that music is innate and biologically powerful. Then there's another set of thinkers who continue to believe that music is some sort of evolutionary byproduct of our intelligent brains, and they see music as invented and sort of biologically superficial. So as a neuroscientist, it's possible to kind of jump into this debate and ask, which view is favored by brain science? And in thinking about this over the last couple of years, I've come to believe that neither of these views is really well supported by brain science. That actually brain science supports a different theoretical perspective that I call music as a transformative technology. That music is an invention. It's not wired into our brains as a biological adaptation, but it's biologically powerful. And through this idea, I'm hoping to raise interest in how music affects other brain functions. But let me give you a little background and walk you through this argument. Why do I think music is invented rather than wired into our brains? Well, there's certainly music-specific knowledge, but there's growing evidence from neuroscience that suggests that music processing is built from non-musical brain systems. So an analogy here is chess. Now, if you play chess, and I show you this picture, which is a picture of a chessboard, you immediately are activating some of your music-specific, not music-specific, you have chess-specific knowledge. So you know, for example, what kind of direction a bishop can move in. You might know what checkmate is, and so forth. But when you play chess, so you have knowledge that's just about chess. That knowledge doesn't apply to anything else in your life, really. It's useless for anything else. It's very specific. But when you play chess, are you using chess-specific brain mechanisms in your brain? Are you doing processing with brain areas that are devoted exclusively to chess? Very unlikely. You're using sequencing, planning, strategizing, imagery. You're doing a lot of things that you do with other parts of your brain for other reasons, but you're putting them together in a special way to play this game. And that's kind of the intuition that I'm getting about music. That it has very specific knowledge. Your knowledge of harmony, for example, is very specific. Your knowledge of how melodies work is very specific to music. But when you process those things, you're using some brain machinery that draws on other things that the brain normally does, like language or auditory pattern perception, motor control, and so on. But then you do have to answer, why is music universal and ancient? Chess, we don't find chess sets from 36,000 years ago, and we don't find chess in every culture, but you do find music ancient and universal. Why? How can that be if it's not wired in somehow? Well, I think an analogy that helps us think about that is fire. Every human culture has the control of fire, and it's a universal. And yet, most biologists would agree this is not because we have fire-making genes or fire-making brain areas. We invented it, and it turned out to be so useful and so powerful for us that it spread through human culture, and the control of energy will always be part of human culture. And you can think about music as that way too. Maybe it's something that was invented but was so powerful in our life, affected us so deeply, that it became part of human culture and we'll never give it up. So I want to give you some specifics now to try and back up this idea that specific aspects of music are connected to other aspects of cognition. Let me start with tonality and its connection to non-musical brain functions. Now, tonality is a uniquely musical system for organizing pitches, involving stable scales and intervals, different emphasis on certain pitches. So you have a tonic, for example. And this kind of organization is not just limited to Western music. For example, Indian music has this system, though the scales are different, but the same kind of principle organization. Now, this does very interesting things to pitches. Pitches in music have very interesting perceptual qualities that are quite abstract and very different from just high or low. And I can illustrate that. This is something you all know, you're all musicians, but one nice illustration of that is just to play a little melody and pay attention to the whole thing and just listen to how it ends. Okay, not a particularly inspiring melody, but it did sound like it ended okay. Let's try this one. Not so good. It doesn't sound complete. There's clearly, you're waiting for the tonic, right? But let me play you the last note of the first melody and the last note of the second melody. They're both a B. You know, it's an identical pitch going into your brain, but you're interpreting it completely differently because of its role in the tonal system. So tonality has this power to create tension and resolution, which is very much part of music. So it reflects abstract relationships between tones. So it's an interesting psychological phenomenon. You could ask, what brain mechanisms process tonality? Well, when we started to do this with neuroimaging, we got a very interesting surprise. In healthy brains, tonal and harmonic processing seems to overlap with linguistic grammatical processing, the processing of structural relationships in language. The first evidence for this was from some work using ERPs, or event-related potentials, which is a form of EEG research from a study I did in 1998. And then it's been replicated and extended using a variety of techniques, brain imaging with MRI, MEG, and so forth. And one finding among many that's been sort of interesting to people is that when you process purely tonal music without words, you still activate areas of the brain that are considered language areas, like Broca's area, which is shown here schematically, painted onto a brain here on the left side. It seems to activate both left and right Broca's area. Well, this initial neuroimaging work has been further supported by a lot of research from behavioral studies, studies with patients, and so forth. I don't have time to go through all that work today, but if you're interested in this line of work and these connections, I do have a chapter in my book, chapter 5, about syntax on music, language, and the brain that has all the details. Okay, let's move to another aspect of music that seems very special to music, and is very special to music. That's synchronization to a musical beat. How could that be related to a non-musical brain function? This is a true musical universal. It emerges spontaneously in children. It's not rooted in language rhythm. Language has rhythm and pattern and timing, but it doesn't have the kind of beat that music has, or much music, I should say. Not all music, but much music around the world has. And this ability to sense a beat and to move to a beat is just fundamental to much of the world's music. And we experienced that very powerfully last night when Kalani was here playing. So it's in African music, it's in Western music, it's all over the world. In fact, ethnomusicologists tell us it's a true universal. Every culture has some form of music with a beat that people move their body to. How could that be related to a non-musical brain function? We don't do that outside of music, typically. Well, one recent hypothesis is that this sort of synchronization, this ability, is an invention that builds on the neural circuitry for another brain ability that's called vocal learning. Vocal learning is simply the ability to learn to produce complicated vocalizations based on your auditory experience. It's what we all do when we learn a language. It seems so not that special. But actually, when you look around comparatively in the animal kingdom, it's extremely unusual. So for example, we're the only primate that has vocal learning. Chimps, our closest relative that shares 98% of our DNA, they have a few innate calls that they can give, but despite decades of trying to teach them to imitate human speech, hopeless. They just don't do it. They just don't have the brain circuitry for it. So we're much different from all of our other primate cousins in this regard. There are, of course, other vocal learning species. Some songbirds learn their songs. Parrots are well-known vocal mimics. Some dolphins and whales, and so forth. But why would vocal learning lay the foundation for moving to a beat? Well, when a brain vocally learns, it has to pay attention to what it's hearing and then what it's doing with its motor system, and then connect those two in a very tight way. So as you learn a language or as you learn a musical instrument, you're constantly listening, and as you produce, you're listening to make sure that what you're doing is matching the model you have that you've heard or that's in your head. So there's an auditory part, there's a motor part, there's an integration part, a very tight integration part. And when you move to a beat, that's a kind of very tight auditory motor integration where people dance with their dogs. And you can watch this on YouTube. And my favorite is a number where it's the whole Olivia Newton-John, what's the other guy's name? Travolta sequence from Grease. They do a whole number. The woman is Olivia Newton-John. I think she's got the dog doing Travolta. But he, you know, the dog is having a great time. He's having a ball. He does all the moves that she's taught him, but there's no sense of him getting the beat at all. So how would you test this idea that moving to a beat actually has some connection to vocal learning? You have to use these predictions that if you saw this behavior, it would only be in other vocal learning species. And this was published in a paper in Music Perception with all the neuroscientific details, if you'd like those. This is what got us onto studying cockatoo dancing, which is something a little bit outside of my normal realm. But knowing that we were interested in the brain basis of synchronization to a beat, a colleague sent us a link to a YouTube video with a dancing cockatoo and said, hey, what do you think? And it was remarkable. This little bird looked like it really was sensing the beat and moving to it. And this is a vocal learning animal because parrots can imitate sound. So, but being a YouTube video, you really don't know what's going on in the background. Is it getting timing cues from a person who's dancing off camera? Can it adjust to different tempi, which is a critical aspect of our ability? If you slow the music down, we can stay synchronized or speed it up and so forth. So we did a controlled study with this bird. We contacted the owner, who runs a bird shelter in Indiana, where the bird was dropped off. And we said, would you collaborate with us? And she said yes. So we actually took the song that he danced to on YouTube, and we slowed it down and sped it up without changing the pitch to 11 different tempi. This was work done with my colleague John Everson, who some of you may have met here. And we made sure nobody was dancing off camera. And then we had him, videotaped him responding to these versions, and then did quantitative analysis of the video with the sound turned off and blind coders and all this stuff. And the bottom line is that he really does synchronize to the musical beat in bouts. That is, he has these periods of synchronization, then he drifts off and continues to dance, but sort of at his own tempo. We think, in a way, somewhat similar to maybe children. And all the details are published in a paper that came out in Current Biology earlier this year, if you'd like to read it. But let me show you a couple of videos, because they're fun. So this is Snowball, and these are not YouTube videos now. These are from our study. And you'll see him dancing to, these are synchronized bouts from, this is a excerpt at 106, which is a little slower than the song's original tempo. Okay. Snowball. I don't think it's a coincidence that he's from Indiana, same state as Michael Jackson was born. And this is tempo. This is the fastest tempo in our experiment. So this is 130 beats per minute. Okay. So there's many remarkable things about that bird, including what you saw at the end when he realized, hey, this is too fast. I need to do something. He figures out I can go side to side, kind of split the beat, And so he's got sensitivity to meter, not just the beat, but he's actually dancing at 2 levels of the metrical hierarchy, which is really impressive. So we're continuing our work with him. He's not unique, by the way. It turns out there's other parrots that do dance to music, though he's very special in having an owner that's willing to do scientific research. Okay, so it would be a fair question to ask, how does this relate to our theme? Okay, he's lost his brains. He's showing movies of dancing parrots. But I think I can bring it back. So let me try and walk you through the logic here. This sort of thing, and the tonality and language, I think, and other stuff, is growing evidence that music processing builds on several non-musical brain systems, okay, like language processing, vocal learning, motor control, and so forth. However, music involves structure, repetition, emotion, and attention. And in the neuroscience world, you put those 4 things together, and you've got a recipe for brain plasticity, for changing the brain. Okay? So if you're using non-musical brain systems and you're doing things that change the brain, then you come up with a very clear prediction that regular engagement with music is going to have lasting effects on non-musical brain functions. And that's just from basic neuroscience. You can derive that idea. So I think this is what is at the heart of my idea that music is a biologically powerful invention, or what I call a transformative technology of the mind. Now remember our music neuroscience question, to what extent does musical behavior influence non-musical brain functions? Well, this is, as I mentioned, it's a question in music neuroscience, not really a central question, but I think this question is central to debates over the evolution of music. And I hope that by taking this kind of, this proposal that I'm putting forth about music as a biologically powerful invention will attract some music neuroscience research to this question. So that's one way I think we can attract music neuroscience to questions that are relevant for music therapy. But of course, we can't just sit around and wait for that to happen. So let's move on to the next part of the talk, which is what can music therapy do to encourage its connections with music neuroscience? Well, I think certain types of music therapy studies are more likely than others to inspire further music neuroscience research. And I'm going to call these bridging studies. Now, I'm going to give a checklist for what I think bridging studies are. Now, let me just be very clear. I'm not arguing that only studies that can answer yes to these checklist items are worth doing. There are music therapy studies that won't mesh with this checklist, but which are still very valuable. I'm just saying that I think music therapy studies that do fulfill this list will be the ones that invite neuroscientists to build on them. Okay, so a bridging study is one that shows statistically significant effects of music therapy with, quote, large sample sizes. They don't have to be huge, but large enough to show that there are significant effects. That compares the effects of music therapy to some other therapy. That provides hypotheses for biological mechanisms. And this is the one that will really attract interest from music neuroscientists, because they'll come in and say, well, no, actually, I think this, and I'm going to go do a study to show that my idea is right. And is published in a widely read scientific journal. Okay? So let me give you, that's our checklist. So let me give you an example of a music therapy bridging study that was recently published. So this is a study that involves a randomized controlled trial and blind scoring. These are things that scientists like to see. Now, it doesn't have any neural measures, and that's fine, because it's a music therapy study, and I think it invites further research. It was published in the journal Brain, which is widely read by neuroscientists and neurologists and physicians. And there's one kind of odd thing about it from the standpoint of music therapy, which is it's a prescriptive music study. That is, music therapists were involved in helping patients choose music and in keeping in touch with them to make sure they were listening and helping them refine their selections, but there wasn't interactive music therapy. However, I think the study raises very important questions about how live musical therapy, which is what I think most people here do and care about, the effects might even be stronger than what was seen in this study, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a few slides. So this is a study of music and recovery after stroke. It was done in Finland at a big Finnish hospital. 60 stroke patients who had big CVA accidents, either on the left or right side of the brain, were randomly divided into 3 groups, and all of the groups had standard post-stroke therapy. One group was a music listening group, one group was a story listening group, and one group was a baseline group, which had no additional therapy. The experimental groups got an hour a day for 2 months of their experimental treatment. So the music therapy group music listening group got to listen for an hour a day to CDs of their own self-selected music. The story listening group listened to books on tape of their own self-selected stories, and then the baseline group had no additional treatment, as I mentioned. And the measures were taken right at baseline, soon after the stroke, and then I think 3 months out, and then 6 months out after the stroke. They did 8 cognitive tasks and 8 mood measures. Again, no neural tests, these are just behavioral tests, but it's interesting that they tested so many things. So for example, they tested verbal memory, short-term memory, language, visuospatial cognition, focused attention, sustained attention, music cognition, and executive functions. Now these are all tests that were done with standardized neuropsychological tests. They didn't develop novel tests for this, so these are tests that could be administered in a few minutes or across a couple of sessions. And they also looked at some mood measures such as tension, depression, irritability, vigor, and so on, listed on the side there. So let me describe what they found. So in terms of the cognitive tests, now that there was 8 cognitive tests, it turns out that most of those tests, the 3 groups didn't show any differences in terms of their performance on these tests. So there were, most of the tests looked like, the results looked a bit like this, the visual spatial cognition, which is one where people look at, read clocks and be able to tell the time or set them to the correct time or draw geometric shapes or recognize geometric shapes. This is, the way this data works is you see it, this is the baseline, everything is referenced to the baseline. So baseline, 0 doesn't mean 0% performance, it just means they normalize everything so that this is sort of how good they were right after their stroke. And then the 3 bars, the 3 different lines represent the 3 different groups. The circles are the music group, the boxes are the language group, and the diamonds are the control group. And they all get better after their stroke. The brain is recovering after stroke in terms of these visuospatial skills. And they all do about equally well 3 months and 6 months after their stroke, independently if they've had music or stories or no special treatment. But there were 2 tasks that did show differences. And in those tasks, the patients in the music group did best. So these were the verbal memory tasks. This is the ability to remember words from a story that you've just been told or were told half an hour ago, or to remember words from a list you've been read. And then focused attention. So that's things like being able to stay on task when you're subtracting numbers, or other kinds of tasks that neuropsychologists have developed to measure how much can you just stay on task with a focused task. These were the 2 tasks that showed differences between the groups, and the music group did better statistically than either group. Okay, that was very interesting. In terms of the mood measures, again, most of those measures didn't show differences between the groups. So, for example, in fatigue, the 3 groups didn't differ in how they scored on these fatigue questionnaires. However, again, there were 2 tests where there were differences between the groups: depression and confusion. And again, patients who'd had music did better than any of the other groups. So in this case, better is down because it's less depression and less confusion, and the music group is scoring better than the control group, not statistically better than the story group, but still better than the control group. Okay, so they also went on to kind of come up with a hypothesized mechanism. And their mechanism for why you should see these effects of just listening to music is that music induces some sort of positive mood in people, which somehow influences cognition. There's a kind of this emotion-cognition link, which is becoming more and more prevalent and to be studied in neuroscience, that emotions aren't separate from cognition, they're very related to cognition. And they point to the possible role of dopamine. There's research in music neuroscience by Dan Levitin and colleagues suggesting that when people experience pleasure as they listen to music, areas of the brain like the ventral tegmental area that release dopamine in response to pleasure are active, and that provides dopamine to large swaths of the brain. And there's other research showing that increased dopamine has effects on attention and global cognitive functioning. So it's one hypothesis. But the great thing about suggesting a hypothesis is that you immediately are going to bring in interest from other people who think that maybe that's not right. So it brings in the debate factor. And you know how much we love debate in this country. So, you know, you've got one music neuroscientist over here saying, oh, I think it's all dopamine is the solution to the nation's problems. And another one saying, you're crazy, you know, that can't have anything to do with it. We need to talk about cortisol. We need to talk about this or that. And so, for example, I think this hypothesis is probably not right, because I think, why would you get effects on just 2 cognitive tasks, the verbal memory and the attention, if it was dopamine? Dopamine should be affecting all these different cognitive functions. That maybe it's something more specific about music's connection with language or with its connection with attention networks in the brain. So I feel like, wow, it would be neat to do a study to look at that. And I think there are multiple ways to build on these findings. So for example, from the music therapy perspective, I think a very clear and well-motivated question is, how would results differ if the patients had had a live therapist? Now, I think there's research in music therapy that shows, looking across a broad variety of studies, that having a live therapist has a better effect on somebody's outcome, a variety of measures, than just having them listen to music. So you have a strong prediction that you'd have stronger effects with live therapy. Maybe more cognitive functions would show enhancement, or the ones that we saw showed enhancement would be even further enhanced. And for music neuroscience, you could ask, what is the relationship between music, neurochemistry, and neural repair? So if I were to do a follow-up study, I would look at cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So one idea is that after a stroke, which is a tremendously stressful event, the brain has very high elevated levels of cortisol, a stress hormone, which affects the hippocampus and other brain systems, memory systems. And perhaps what music is doing is it's reducing stress in these people. It's lowering cortisol levels, and perhaps that, in combination with the increased dopamine, is facilitating the brain's own internal processes of neural repair. And I think you could study that quantitatively using brain imaging and measures of these neurochemicals. Okay, so let me summarize the recommendations for music, how music therapy can engage and reach out to music neuroscience. Simple. Seek opportunities to do these kinds of bridging studies. Studies that have the kind of characteristics I'm talking about, but which perhaps involve live therapy rather than just recorded music. And I think this is a natural way for music therapists and music neuroscientists to collaborate. Music therapists may have great ideas about what the best kind of therapy to deliver is. The music neuroscientists may have good ideas about how to design the control condition, how to take those measures and do the statistics and so forth. Just to give an example, music and Alzheimer's would be a great thing to study in this regard. I know many music therapists work with Alzheimer's patients and report anecdotally that they see real differences after music therapy. Well, that would be very interesting to quantify, looking at how music affects cognitive function in Alzheimer's disease, comparing music to some other condition, some other kind of interaction, using brain imaging to look at what's happening in the brains of these people. And the second recommendation is to take what's out there and run with it, to capitalize on the existing bridging studies. So stroke affects over 500,000 Americans each year. That's just in America. And you've got a study now that's been published in Brain that meets all the scientific criteria. You can walk into a doctor's office and say, look, I think I can do better. You know, we've already got evidence that music can have an effect after stroke with depression, with memory, with attention. By doing real music therapy, I think I can beat these effects and have other effects. So I think you can capitalize on these sorts of things. And the American Stroke Association is a big association. They're looking for ideas and ways to improve quality of life after stroke, and you've got a chance to capitalize on it by using bridging studies. Okay, I'd like to finish up with an example of a synergy. So kind of a glimpse of the future, where I think this connection between our fields, how I think it can work. Because there is one example that I think, and there are actually more than one example, but there's the example I want to talk about illustrates this. This has to do with melodic intonation therapy, which probably many of you are familiar with. This is a treatment for non-fluent aphasia, so people have had a stroke that's affected their language abilities, their ability to communicate. They often have great difficulty getting a word out or a sentence or a phrase. But there's reason to be interested in how music might help them because of the clinical observation that's over 100 years old, that some of these patients can still sing fluent songs that they knew from before their stroke. So that suggests something about music is intact and could perhaps be used to facilitate the recovery of speech. That led to the development of melodic intonation therapy in the 70s in Boston at the Boston VA Hospital. And probably you're familiar with this. Melodic intonation therapy takes ordinary day-to-day phrases like, I love my children. It has the patient repeat them, but has them not just repeat them normally, but in a special kind of musical way, using fixed pitches. It uses just 2 pitches, high and low, but they are fixed pitches, which is a musical kind of, proto-musical kind of system. So instead of just saying, I love my children, it would be, I love my children, and so on. Repeating after the therapist, synchronizing with the therapist, and also tapping the rhythm of the sentence at the same time, which is, so there's a rhythmic component as well as a melodic component. There is ongoing work in the laboratory of my colleague, Dr. Gottfried Schlag at the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, comparing the efficacy of melodic intonation therapy to a very closely matched but non-musical therapy. It's called speech repetition therapy. All the same kinds of interactions with the therapist, same number of sessions, same number of hours, same phrases, but they don't do it melodically. They just repeat after me kind of therapy. So they leave out the tapping, the rhythmic tapping, and this melodic intonation. And this is intensive interactive therapy. So this is not a just listening study. This is really, you need a therapist and a lot of time with a therapist. An hour a day per week, an hour a day for several weeks, I believe. And he's showing, the data are still preliminary, but he's showing that this kind of therapy does have quantitative effects. It's better than this other non-musical therapy in terms of eliciting better recovery of fluency, in terms of patients being able to generalize to non-stock utterances, actually being able to utter the novel things that they want to say, and so forth. So it's looking good, but the data are still coming in. What mechanisms underlie this effect? Why would we even see this effect? How can we relate this back to brain science? Well, there is work from basic brain science suggesting that singing and speaking, although they have much overlap in the brain, there is some differentiation, and singing involves some specialized right hemisphere brain areas that are just not activated when you sing. There are parts of your brain that get activated when you sing that don't get activated when you speak. So this is basic science. Here's one area in the superior temporal gyrus. This is just an MRI slide. It's probably hard to see in the back, but there's a little yellow spot from this MRI study from Dan Callan and colleagues of a right hemisphere area that's activated when singing but not when speaking. So anyway, there are these special areas in the right hemisphere. So Gottfried hypothesized that what's happening with this melodic intonation therapy is you're taking this singing aspect, and you're activating these right hemisphere areas, and through mechanisms of brain plasticity, you're actually helping them wire themselves up and take over for damaged left hemisphere areas. They're taking over linguistic functions. They're originally just song regions of the brain, if you will, but through practice they're becoming kind of new speech regions. And he actually has some intriguing preliminary evidence for that from his own fMRI research with patients after they've undergone melodic intonation therapy versus this other repetition therapy. He images their brain while they speak. So they're not singing anymore, they're speaking utterances. And this is slides from, these two images are from a patient that's undergone melodic intonation therapy, and this is from a patient who's undergone this other type of repetition therapy. And what you can see is on the melodic intonation therapy patient is activating the right hemisphere much more intensely when they speak now after this therapy, whereas the other patient is not. So they're doing better on speaking, and they're recruiting the right hemisphere more for their speech than a patient who's had a different kind of therapy. So supporting this idea of this kind of compensation of function. The other interesting finding that Gottfried has produced recently is some preliminary evidence that this melodic intonation therapy also influences the connections in the brain, the physical connectivity of the brain. Now there's a big information superhighway in the brain called the arcuate fasciculus that connects posterior temporal regions to anterior frontal regions. You have one on each side of your brain. This is a schematic of it in this slide. It's quite a large fiber bundle. And it's in all the patients he studied, they had left hemisphere stroke. So the left hemisphere arcuate fasciculus was severely damaged. But he was able to study the right hemisphere arcuate fasciculus using a technique called diffusion tensor imaging, which is an MRI technique that allows you to actually trace pathways in the brain and study the size and other characteristics of pathways. Now these slides might be a little hard to interpret, but basically it's sort of a see-through image of a brain, and you see a little green band, that's the arcuate fasciculus, in a patient before and after treatment with melodic intonation therapy. And I hope that what you'll be able to see is it looks like it's a bit thicker after treatment. Well, actually, we're not sure it's physically thicker. These neural measures are based on MRI signals, and interpreting those signals is a little bit tricky. So it could be that their fibers are thicker, it could be that there are more fibers, it could be that the existing fibers are just getting used more and therefore are the axons are a bit wider. We don't know exactly what's underlying the effect at the really low level mechanistic level yet, but there's definitely some evidence that something is changing in terms of this brain connection, this major brain connection between the back of the brain and the front of the brain. And that is pretty exciting, I think, because it can actually look at the brain and say, hey, music therapy is having an effect on the very structure of the brain. And I think that gives us kind of, I should just say, we're still waiting for the control data to see if the effects are special for music, but I think already it's exciting what he's finding. So I think this gives us a kind of a glimpse of the future, of a way that music neuroscience and music therapy can be meaningfully integrated. And that's by longitudinal studies that collect neural data before, during, and after music therapy. So you're actually watching how the patient's behavior and their condition changes in terms of their everyday life, but you're also watching the brain, and you're seeing what's going on and changing inside the brain. And I think putting those together is just amazingly powerful. And I think such synergies will raise the profile of both of our fields, music therapy and music neuroscience, and will improve human life. So let me just make some concluding remarks. We've talked a lot about MRI, and it all starts to sound a little bit technical. But coming to this conference and seeing how committed you are to your field really has made me think back to how I got to be where I am today. And before all the science and neuroscience and all that, it all started with passionate and committed teachers. A high school band teacher who was so committed to teaching and had to take a job at Radio Shack because he couldn't afford to pay the bills by just being a band teacher, but decided he'd rather do that and have two jobs than take a different kind of profession and just work one job. A guitar teacher, a classical guitar teacher in graduate school who was so committed to his craft and his composing that instead of taking another job, he kept teaching even though he had very little money. And I remember I used to take lessons at his place. And in the winter, he would heat it to about 55 degrees because that's what he could afford in terms of paying the heat bills. And if any of you have had classical guitar lessons at 55 degrees, I can tell you that's a remarkable way of clearing the mind. But the point is, music brings out passion in people, and I see that kind of passion in the people I've met here, and that's been a real re-inspiration for me in my work to try and connect it to what you do. So let me end by thanking you, the AMTA and the San Diego Music Therapists again, who welcomed me into their world, my close colleague John Everson, who I work with, and the Neurosciences Research Foundation that supports this work. Thank you very much.
I think I can tell by your overwhelming response that this was a wonderful choice for renewing our series lecture series, and is a very, very, very small token of our appreciation to Dr. Patel. I would like to present him with the Friend of Music Therapy Award.